Okay, so it's a real pleasure to introduce Frida Polli, who is the CEO and founder of Pymetrics, as our guest speaker to this final class today. Frida, I'll let you talk about your background, but just to give people a little overview, assuming that LinkedIn, as usual, reports the absolute truth about people's background, which is in your case, I'm sure, true. You have a BA in English from Dartmouth College, then a PhD in neuropsychology from Suffolk University, and then an MBA from Harvard Business School. So you really went from kind of being a poet to being a hardcore scientist and now a brilliant business person. And, so I guess the first question or ask is that you give us a little bit of a longer, kind of a more, colorful background on your journey and what led you to start Pymetrics, with specifically attending to the question of why someone smart and employable, like the people in this class, might want to consider being an entrepreneur, or why they might want to forget that altogether.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay, cool. So welcome. Hi, everyone. Great to meet you. And if you have any questions, just, interrupt me while I'm talking. I think that's definitely the best way to go. So what you said is true. I was an English major at Dartmouth. I was pre-med, post-bac. Then I discovered that I didn't like bodily fluids, so medical school was not for me. And so then I sort of switched over to PhD track, because ultimately at the end of the day, I mostly wanted to study the brain. And I was actually fortunate because around the time that I was applying to PhD programs, brain imaging was coming online. The bad part was, you may not believe this, Tomas, but no sort of established program had any neuroimaging program that came in the mid 2000s, and I was applying in like early 2000, I guess. And so I went to was a very small and innovative program at Suffolk because I wanted to study brain imaging as a graduate student. And because they didn't provide funding, you had to go get your own funding. It was a perfect opportunity for me to go and study at this big imaging center in Boston called the Martino Center, which was basically MGA, Harvard and MIT affiliated. So that was kind of my path into neuroscience and brain imaging. And it was really very fortuitous because prior to brain imaging, the only way you could study the brain was chopping off the heads of mice and doing all sorts of cruel things to them. And that was definitely not for me. So I basically got my PhD at Suffolk, and during that entire time was funded through the medical school at Harvard. And then as a postdoc at MIT. So really in the mecca of brain imaging, early days of cognitive neuroscience, like very, very exciting stuff, got to work with some of the pioneers in the field and really thought that was going to be my path in life. I thought once I had arrived at my postdoc at MIT to work with the world-renowned John Gabrielli, there was nothing beyond that. And so it was kind of weirded out, to say the least, when I was finding myself unfulfilled. And then what I realized was that I really wanted to do something more applied with the research that we had been amassing in the lab. And so that's ultimately what led me to pursue an MBA. And it's actually kind of a funny story because amongst PhDs and amongst scientists, MBAs, an MBA doesn't have the best reputation. Tomas, I think you can attest to that. I had many people be like, why do you want to get an MBA? It's a bullshit degree. And I was like, okay, thank you for your feedback. And so I did it anyways. And I actually think that I say this all the time. I think that's ill-informed. I think that an MBA teaches you a lot, but it's just very different than a PhD. So I went to the business school at Harvard, sort of pitching myself as, a life science entrepreneur, didn't exactly know what that was going to morph into. And it was really there that I saw recruiting firsthand for the first time since college. And that had been a while. And I was just shocked by the fact that it hadn't changed. And really what I saw in front of me, it was like the proverbial light bulb going off, because what I saw was a matching problem. There were people who didn't know what they should be matching to. And there were recruiters, on the other hand, who didn't know who out of this vast ocean they should be selecting. And what they were trying to use to make that decision seemed very unscientific, meaning a resume. And also what they were trying to glean from the resume was not what was your background, because that was easy to figure out. And, for MBA students, pretty short. It was more like, what are your soft skills, right? They were trying to glean soft skills from a resume, from hard skills. And they would be like, oh, I need a team player. Let's see if you've played any team sports, things like that. And so that's where, again, the proverbial light bulb went off, because to my mind, it was like, the last couple of decades of cognitive science have been about developing assessments, behavioral assessments that can tell us about people's cognitive, social, and emotional aptitudes, traits, features, whatever you want to call them. Data science had just come online really in sort of the mid 2000s. So that was kind of at the forefront, and people were using data science in very powerful ways. So that seemed like a, obvious component. And then, sort of technology powered platforms that combine behavioral science and data science were everywhere. They were dating apps, they were Amazon, they were Netflix, they were all around us. And it was just shocking to me that that didn't exist in the career space. So that was kind of how Pymetrics came to be. It was just realizing that this new science that we had been developing in the lab, or we collectively, I mean, it's tens of thousands of behavioral scientists, cognitive scientists, whatever you want to call them, it's a pretty interdisciplinary field, had been developing these assays now for decades. So it was, there was a real new science that was being brought to bear. And then you couple that with data science, and it seemed like a very powerful combination of tools to bring to what to me seemed like a very obvious problem, in terms of like the fact that it was a big market and you could understand why it mattered and everything else. And yet that, no one had really developed the ideal, or the solutions out there weren't as ideal, I think, as what I thought could be developed. So that's kind of how Pymetrics, the idea for Pymetrics came to be. And then we were just lucky, because HBS, like, first of all, we had tons of people that wanted to go through Pymetrics even before they got any feedback, because they were like, what has Frida been doing these last 2 years? And then we also just had a lot of companies that were willing to work with us in a very sort of pilot way to figure out, okay, does this stuff work? Does it predict anything? And so on. So it was definitely a good ecosystem to try out the early product. And so then, I mean, like, from that to where we are now, like we bootstrapped for a year. Our first client was actually a very large hedge fund that paid us for a month of consulting, 6 figures. We're like, okay. And so we did that. And then we raised our seed series round in late 2013 from Coastal Ventures. Coastal is a pretty well-known science focused VC. They do other stuff too. And then basically that the first couple of years were just really developing the product. And then, 2016, we were in market with a product. That was our sort of breakout year in terms of actually having a product to sell to clients. And so it's been basically 4 years of having a product in market. And, we've grown, basically doubled revenue year over year, like, have about 100 clients now. It's an enterprise product. So 100 clients may not sound like a lot, but they're relatively large engagements. And yeah, I mean, I don't know what else you guys want to know.
Let me jump in first and ask you whether going from a PhD to an MBA is a bit like being a classical musician and then you do pop. Is that the kind of is that a valid analogy in a way, in the way of a reputation?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't know that I would use it. So ish. I would say ish, because I knew nothing about business, right? I mean, I had never left science. And so, yeah, it's definitely having a snack of everything as opposed to having like a like full on meal. So in that sense, I would say yes. I think what's actually really important about the MBA degree, forget about what you're actually learning in terms of content, at least from my experience at HBS, which really focuses on the case method. What I think many scientists never learn, and is really important for business, is the ability to make decisions in situations of imperfect and uncertain information, which is basically all the time in business and almost never in science. And so I think that is a skill set that is just, you cannot overemphasize how important that is. And even me, I mean, when I first started Pymetrics, like it took me a while to kind of get there, but I think that the 2 years that I had spent kind of watching that and, sort of gleaning what I could from the case method was actually really important. So I think that more than anything, Tomas, was the thing that really convinced me. It was really just it was practicing decision making for 2 years that I thought was really important.
Yeah. Let me ask you a very HR-y question,
Sure.
which you might hate, but since that's
Okay.
our industry at the end of the day, what are the 2 or 3 key skills, hard or soft, that you need to be a good PhD student, that you need to be a good MBA student, and that you need to be a good entrepreneur?
Yeah.
And you can, because you went through the 3 environments, and and there's people now in this group who are considering and still have the 3 paths to go forward. So what would you say?
Right. So Tomas, you and I have a somewhat philosophical disagreement about this. I don't think there are 3 skills that make you good at anything in life. And that's sort of what Pymetrics is. It's a fit-based system. It's a matching system. So I'll answer what I think was helpful for me, and then you guys can sort of glean from that what you will. So I think that to be a good entrepreneur, there are a couple things. Again, for me, I don't think this is true for all entrepreneurs. For me, it was very important to be connected and passionate about the purpose of the company. So I could never be a good entrepreneur, if it was just about selling it in 3 years. Again, there are lots of entrepreneurs where that would be a good that is working, that does work, but not for me. I think that's one aspect of it. I think the second thing I would say is I think you have to be an irrational optimist, because I think the odds of any company working out are very slim, but you have to start the company anyways. And so I think being an irrational optimist, at least for me, served me well and continues to serve me well. I'll never forget, like I had these professors at HBS who were like, because I actually used my second year at HBS to kind of, do some research on, because we had sort of started the company at that point. And I'll never forget, one of my professors was like, well, what are you going to do if it doesn't work out? And I was like, looking at him like, what do you mean if it doesn't work out? Like, I just couldn't even fathom the fact that it wasn't going to work out. And in his mind, it was like very likely that it wasn't going to work out. And he was trying to like help me understand, like, what was I prepared for this eventuality? So I thought that was pretty funny. And then the third thing I would say is just, I think being extremely persistent, which in life in general has actually been a flaw in many environments. Persistence is sometimes viewed as like, oh, she won't go away, dog with a bone, whatever. But I think in being an entrepreneur, it's actually, it's actually a good quality. And I think that a lot of the 3 things I just mentioned, for me in any case, I think were really important, in my scientific career as well. I would add to that I think I'm somebody who just really loves discovery. Like I love to discover and invent and create. I think that's what drew me to brain imaging when it was an early field. I think that's what drew me to Pymetrics. And I think that that's why my brain, like people are like, oh, what books do you read in your free time? Thinking I read business books. And I'm like, I read books on cyber security threats, like, because my mind needs to like think about different problems. So I love, I think learning and creativity and the wanting to discover and innovate is critical both for certain types of entrepreneurship and certainly for science, in my opinion. But again, there are lots of scientists that don't look like me. So I think it's hard to have like, 3 things that work for everyone. But if you can, if anything from my story resonates, those are the things that I think are important for having.
Yeah, no, and this is I think, this is an item on which we probably agree. I did tell them that, we often disagree and we love to disagree, but they also know that when we agree, you're always right. So that's the important part.
Right.
Hey, so there is already a question from Steve,
Sure.
which will pick up from this chat. So hearing your postdoc experience at MIT after your PhD, did you initially want to become a professor? Just curious to know if it was your experience in academia that prompted you to embark on a new venture. So did academia turned you into an entrepreneur, basically?
No, I don't think so. So yeah, I didn't want to be a professor. I basically wanted to go back and be a research scientist, research professor at the medical school at Harvard, where that was basically the plan, and they were waiting for me. You're always told that you have to go be a postdoc somewhere else so that where you did your graduate work will think of you 10 times more highly than they did when you were a graduate student, which is true of life in general. But yeah, that was kind of like the goal, was to go back to the Martino Center and really build a research program and a lab and everything else. So yes, that was absolutely what I wanted to do. No, academia didn't drive me away. I think it basically came down to the fact that while I was learning, I was fascinated. But then when it was just like rinse and repeat, I was like, okay, now what? And I didn't see a future to something different because I couldn't see the connection between what I had learned and actually using that to alter some, to have an impact. Because, research at the end of the day, you're just, developing knowledge, but you're not having an impact. And I guess I had been more optimistic about what technologies would be available to make an impact, and those just hadn't either materialized, or they involved sticking electrodes in people's heads, and I've already explained to you that's not really my thing. So I saw the pathways for making an impact be more limited, and I think ultimately that's what ended up like leading me somewhere else. And then I think the other thing is that Tomas, I'm curious on your thoughts, but it's much harder to be a generalist in science. And I think ultimately what I realized is that I'm prefer being a generalist than knowing the tremendous amount about this teeny little thing. I'd much prefer to know less about a much broader array of subjects. And I didn't know that about myself until I kind of got to that point. I think it's hard to be a generalist. So,
I think, and this was some advice or a comment that I picked up early on in my PhD years from someone who was from a totally different area and didn't finish the PhD. Is like, the best about doing a PhD is not what you will learn, but the method, the approach. And 100%. I think it's great if you are a generalist, but then if you know to value people who have that discipline and expertise,
for sure.
That's very important. Hey, let me talk about the area that we're both very passionate about.
Let's put another note in the chat window as well, though, Tomas, just to be.
I'll pick up on Sophie's comment in a sec. But I wanna touch on what is probably the biggest question or area in this field, and the area where we are not just passionately united intellectually, but also equally frustrated when we try to explain what ethical AI could do and can do in the real world to an audience that is increasingly scared, paranoid, skeptical. So can you summarize, the main differences between ethical and unethical AI, what could and should do, and what we definitely don't want, either with examples or conceptually? And by the way, guys, Frida is also the voice in the World Economic Forum speaking about these issues. So she is probably the authority on AI ethics, at least in human capital. So what would be your overview?
Sure. So, and sorry, I have all my kids home today. So if you hear screaming in the background of any kind, that's what it's coming from. So
it's because they have their views on ethical AI. So we should include them in.
When I say something wrong, they start hollering. They're like, no, they can't be. So yes, absolutely, Tomas, that's right. Look, I think at the end of the day, AI is like any other technology. It's really in the design of the technology. So I guess the question then is like, well, how do you design technology to be, in quotes, ethical versus not, right? I would start with the premise that I don't think, so there are general governing principles that will, lead to the creation of ethical AI. It's things like transparency and explainability and, fairness and all the rest of it. So those are great. And Nature had a paper, basically summarizing, at that point, there were 141 organizations that had put out ethical principles, and they all agreed on these 5 things, data privacy, whatever. Now there's 180. I think it's very easy to come up with the general principles. I think what is much, much, much harder is actually putting those into action. And there are many reasons it's hard, and I can kind of explain to you some of them, having sort of done it myself. So for the topic, or for the field of HR, I think what makes a system ethical are some of the following things, and then I can explain to you kind of what makes some of these things hard. So, and hopefully this isn't, I think for this audience, it's fine. So one is, I think you should care a lot about the data that goes into the system. So, and unfortunately, it's really tough, because I think many data sets that we use in behavioral prediction have inherent differences in base rates. So what I mean by that is, engineering degrees are not equally obtained by men and women, right? So that's an obvious example of a skill that has, different base rates in the population, right? The advantage that Pymetrics has is that soft skills, at least the way we measure them and the way we design the system, and we actively steered clear of a few assays we could have used, are generally equally distributed between genders and races. And we did that on purpose, because when you start ingesting data sets that have differences in population base rates, you get into many problems down the road that I can get into in more detail. So I think that's really element number one that's critical. And I do not think that many systems think of that, or they don't build that into their system, because they're just ingesting job descriptions and resumes or whatever the case may be, and then it's just very hard to sort of reverse engineer that. So that's just point number one. Point number two, and sorry, and I'll just pick on why it's important, because we're going to talk about it in a second. Because at the end of the day, fairness, there are 21 definitions of fairness according to data scientists, machine learning experts. There are sort of 2 or 3 that I think are the most important in recruiting or hiring. So one is fairness by blindness. You shouldn't have any information about gender, race, or anything else in your algorithm. The second is group fairness. So that means that you don't have a disparate impact. You're not sort of preferencing one group versus another. And then the third is disparate treatment, which is basically individual fairness. So it's this, and the tension between group and individual fairness is where many tools get into problems. You guys probably are not as big nerds as I am, but there's a famous, case, Ricci versus something or other, where sort of the whole idea of group fairness and individual fairness being in opposition came to be. Now, the reason that they are in opposition, or sorry, the circumstances under which they're in opposition occur when there are differences in base rates in the population, and only occur then. So if you actually had data that had equal base rates among men and women and people of color across the spectrum, you actually would not have this tension. But the problem is in HR that's usually not the case. Again, the engineering degree one being a good example, but there are many. And so I think that's why this data issue is so critical. And we sort of solved that at the front end, which I think gives us, a good advantage to the second component of what I think is important for ethical AI, which is, basically pre-testing your algorithms before you release them, testing them after you release them, and just knowing what they're doing, basically. So we have and you could, I personally think, and our sort of philosophy and practice at Pymetrics is that if an algorithm has disparate impact, we won't release it. So sorry, I'm just going to pause here. Does everybody know what disparate impact means? Like 4/5 rule?
Yeah, so we
Yes,
talked
group
about
fairness.
adverse impact. You might, I'm sure you're gonna get
Adverse-
questions on that. So I'll let you
Okay.
finish with this, and then we'll run into the
Okay,
technicals.
sure. Yeah. So basically, so the way we build our algorithms, it's basically we dual optimize for both performance and disparate impact. Now, because of the data that the data qualities that I just mentioned, there is no trade-off. And therefore I think we're in a very good position to therefore say, as a company, we won't release an algorithm if it has adverse impact, disparate impact. And yet it still has to meet these pretty stringent performance criteria. So that's sort of number 2, is that we pre-test all of our algorithms, and then we obviously post-test them after release. And then obviously if we see some issues, we will do something to remediate. Whenever you build an algorithm and then you put it out there, it doesn't always perform exactly how you'd like it to. So I would say in 5% of cases we have to do something on the back end. And then I think the third thing, and this is we actually just finished a third-party audit of our system that was done by somebody who's a professor at Northeastern and associated with the Berkman Klein Institute at Harvard. And actually, yay, today we found out it got accepted at FACT, which used to be FATML. It's the Fairness and Accountability and Transparency in Machine Learning Conference. I think providing some sort of assurance using third parties is my belief that your system is actually doing what you say it's doing is actually critical in this day and age. Like, I'm a big believer that, the public has lost trust in technology companies because they say all these things, but they don't actually do them. And I think there's many examples of that. Some more prominent than others that have been in the news in the last couple of weeks. And so I think we have to, as technologists, take on an additional burden and say, you know what, like hold me more accountable than you otherwise would. And I'll show you that I'm doing what I say I'm doing. So I think I think transparency in some form, and I think third-party audits are a good way to go, is another component that I would add to the what does ethical AI mean to me. So those are kind of the three pillars that I think are important. And then being involved in standard setting and stuff like that. Although I think, again, that's back to like, well, if you're just saying, yes, I agree to these principles, but I'm not actually putting any of that into practice, I think that has less value overall. So I think the first three things that I mentioned, I think are kind of the most important.
Great, that's very clear. So let me ask you Sophie's question. Can you please talk more about how we know that executive functioning tasks predict soft skills, and give us a sense, for people who haven't gone through your games or assessments or tools, what's the process of mapping executive functioning to soft skills, which is an unconventional and, really new approach to doing this, right?
Yeah. Well, so and we have a number of patents for this. So the entire platform started out with the idea that in behavioral science, cognitive science, whatever name you want to put to it, we had been researching for decades that this tool here predicts fill in the blank. You know what I mean? And my definition of soft skills may be slightly different than yours, but my definition is, sort of cognitive style, personality or emotional style, and socio-emotional style, right? So I would lump in anything that's not sort of an IQ test into the soft skill bucket, because I think sort of whether you are better at task switching versus staying focused, or whether you are attentive to detail versus novelty seeking, all these things to my mind are soft skills, right? And I mean, you could argue that, well, we won't go there anyway. So really what we did was, pick assays or tasks or exercises that we knew from, decades worth of research, not done by me specifically, but done by the broader community, that this task, you can extract 6 features and those features measure, these subcomponents. And that was just really all derived from the literature. So most of the construct validity and content validity of the tool comes from decades worth of, research that was not done by us. Including, and some of the research is just basically saying, okay, yes, the balloon task measures risk, and we know that because of these studies. And then there are also additional tasks that have been done that actually link it to job performance. And then we've done a lot of that work ourselves. So we've done a lot of work of saying, okay, they measure these soft skills. Now, how do we know that it actually predicts, KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities as defined by ONET? But there have been others that have used some of the tasks that we use in a research context to also look at their relationship to job related knowledge, skills, and abilities. So did that answer the question? Or
so I guess maybe, Sophie, if I'm jumping in and interpreting or expanding the question, have you been able to identify new ways to evaluate new soft skills? Because impulsivity, risk-taking, etc., as you say, there is a solid line of research, and all you have to do is digitize it and funkify it. But things like maybe curiosity or resilience, or and any innovations around there.
Yeah, let me see if I'm answering that question. So I 100% think that behavioral science offers a lens into soft skills that, personality questionnaires or more traditional tools do not, right? Mostly because they come from a different discipline of science, and they measure people differently. We don't ask them questions. Obviously, we put them through exercises. So as a result, it's funny because people are like, oh, are you a psychology tool? We're like, no, it's a different discipline. I mean, yes, it's, it's interdisciplinary, not to say these tools would never get used in psychology research, but I think sort of cognitive science, behavioral science is slightly different in its framing. It's less theory driven and it's more life science like, in the sense that everyone agrees in cognitive science that these are the things we measure, as opposed to psychology. There's like big wars that have happened over whether you're a Freudian or a cognitive behavioralist, right? So the point that I'm trying to make is that there's sort of building blocks of human behavior that are accepted sort of dogma in cognitive science, and that's what Pymetrics measures. When it comes to resilience, I don't think that and they're more sort of first order building blocks is the way that I would think about it, rather than things like resilience, which I think are more psychological constructs. Now, what I always tell people is that I think that the first order, constructs then can be lumped together, to form some of these second order. But to my mind, at the end of the day, this is all definitional. Like, I don't actually care whether you call it grit, resilience, whatever English language or Spanish language or whatever language term you want to put on it. I don't actually care. So long as the system is interoperable, so long as what I measure can be linked to behaviors on the job, I don't care what the name of that behavior is. Does that make sense? That's just
so in a way, could we say, would, at least for this group or class, would it be an accurate description to say that you're using technology to digitize and improve the candidate experience of science-based executive functioning tests that predict relevant behavioral outcomes? And you don't care about if you call it, a soft skill or not, because it is relevant and you have an inclusive and accurate way to evaluate them. Would that be an accurate description?
Yeah, I think the way that I would tweak that slightly, and I would say that for me, a soft skill is anything that's not something that I've learned and experienced. Like, can I program in Java or, whatever. So to me, the broad range of soft skills include what Pymetrics measures. Now, they may not map onto some other taxonomy of what we think of as soft skills, but I think soft skills are quite broad, if that makes sense. And I think at the end of the day, we're measuring people. So whatever you decide to measure, you're kind of getting, I think, ultimately at the same thing. You're trying to measure things that are more fundamental about people, that are more innate than they are learned, although there is some learning component and so on and so forth. So I think the words that we use to describe those soft skills is far less important, because I think at the end of the day, if you're measuring a broad spectrum of things, and we measure everything from like executive functioning to certain socio-emotional things like risk reward behavior, how you're influenced by intrinsic versus extrinsic things, whether you're altruistic versus self-interested, and the library is continuing to expand. But at the end of the day, I think I think we're all kind of arriving at the same thing. And we have a paper under review right now showing how a lot of the stuff that we measure is linked to the big five. I mean, so I think there's, again, it's back to that interoperability, Tomas, also known as, content or construct validity, where so long as you can show relationships with previous things that have been measured, I think that sort of puts you in the general ballpark of we're soft skills and we're measuring soft skills. I think the advantage to the way we do things is the actual exercises that you go through are unchanged from what you would use in the lab. So we haven't taken the approach of like, oh, we're going to create our own game and then we're going to link it through correlation to some other studies. The actual behaviors we measure are what have been shown in the lab to, correlate with neural activity and, whatever. So they're actually the actual assays that we used to use in science. So I do feel very confident in saying they measure the constructs that we say they measure, as opposed to others have taken the approach of like, well, we'll develop some cool games and then we'll sort of correlate them with other things.
Yeah, or hope that they work.
Yeah, or hope that they work, right.
Yeah. Hey, Kelechi is asking you to expand a little bit on what you said earlier about the problem with ethical AI being rooted in the disagreement between group fairness and individual fairness.
Sure, yeah. So, okay, so let's put it this way. So let's say that some quality that is more prevalent in men than women, let's forget about quality. Some aspect of something is more prevalent in men than women, okay? And that's the data set that I'm working with. So
I'm personally struggling to think of one, but let's push my imagination to the limits and imagine that could be.
Exactly. So imagine that were the case, right? So then what would happen is if you were to go and, use historical data, which by the way, all assessments do, whether they're machine learning or something else, they use historical patterns to then predict future behavior, which is the entire premise of behavioral science, right? And by behavioral science, I mean psychology, I mean anything that's sort of trying to predict human behavior. If you use data that is different between men and women, I'll give you a silly example. There are more men named John than there are women in the Fortune 500 CEO set, right? So if I took name as a predictor, right, and tried to use that to predict future CEOs, I would continue to perpetuate men because they would be, because the name John would be, male names would be linked to performance, right? So that's an instance where base rates of variables are quite different, right? There are not that many women named John, maybe a few. As opposed to what Pymetrics does is say, okay, there are Johns and Janes, and I'm only going to use data that you can find equally in Jane and Jamal and John and Juan. Does that make sense? And so if you do that, you don't have to, there's not that trade-off between, so let's go back to the John example. So now I'm going to use an algorithm that, John predicts very well whether someone's going to be a CEO. So now to make that equitable, I have to de-weight that trait. And then all the Johns in the population are going to say, well, wait a minute, why did you do that? It predicts behavior. Now you're being unfair to me. Does that make sense? They're taking the perspective of individual fairness and saying the name John predicts this really well. Why are you now putting me at a disadvantage by de-weighting that variable, right? Versus if you take traits or features, whatever, that are equally present between John and Jane and Jamal and Juan, and use those, you don't have to get into that debate of like, oh, I took something away that preferentially predicted John to make Jane or Juan or Jamal more likely to show up in my prediction set. Does that make sense to whoever asked the question?
Yep, Kelechi is nodding, yeah, so we'll take that. Do you want to add something? Okay, so it was not just, it was perfect, so thank you for that. Yeah. Hey, I don't want to bastardize your line about AI, everyone, that it's like, what is it? It's like teenage sex. Everyone is talking about it, but no one is doing it.
Yeah, everyone says they're doing it, but nobody knows what it is. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it must be frustrating for you as an entrepreneur, but also as an expert in the field, where the buyer isn't necessarily the most technical or sophisticated, to use a euphemistic understatement, to have a crowded field, competitors coming out right, left, and center, claiming to do AI without even thinking about 10% of the issues that you're raising now. Right. And at the same time, the backlash throws you in the same bag, because when someone thinks, so, the bad parts that the market affects, thinks about in terms of reputation, it's waves that might crush you. Right. And then the good parts, you don't benefit because, so talk a little bit about that. What your frustration, do you think the field is, the buyers are maturing and other people, the standards are going to be high enough on others, or, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally know what you're saying. So again, this is my optimism, potentially it's irrational, I'm not sure, but, I think what you described is accurate, but I think that there are some pretty significant sort of movements or tides that are changing. So, I think there have been, I mean, there is an increasing amount of increasing amount of interest in local, state, and federal regulation. And by regulation, I don't mean like heavy regulation, but really a lot of it is focused on transparency. And we're 100% supportive of this, and we've actually testified, on behalf of some of this, regulation, and will continue to do so. And, the most recent example of this was, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, Tomas, but there was a letter sent to the EEOC by Senator Mark Bennett's office. So I believe that with this call for increased transparency, increased accountability, and so on and so forth, I actually think vendors that are doing it right, both from a machine learning perspective and a fairness perspective, are going to be, it's going to come out in all of this. Do you know what I mean? So the people who are saying they're doing stuff, but they're not, then that's going to become obvious. And the people that are claiming unbiased, but they're actually biased, I think that's going to come out as well. So I actually feel pretty optimistic these days because of all of those, sort of things that we see happening. And okay, this is a total side note. Whatever, you take this as you will, but I actually think that we would be far better off if hiring tools and other tools were more regulated by an FDA-like structure than what's happening now. Like, I actually think that because think about it, Tomas, I mean, how many times have I heard something like, there's been no innovation, everything's old. The reason there's been no innovation, the reason everything's, at least from my vantage point, is because Currently the older tools, whatever they are, basically either most of them have been essentially battle tested, right? So if they have adverse impact, they've been brought to court and won, or they have decades worth of exposure to not having adverse impact. But basically, as a new entrant, unless you can't compete because of sort of this regulatory capture. And what that's led to is just a lot of older technology that's been around for a long time without an ability to innovate. And the number of times I've been asked as the CEO of Pymetrics, like, well, have you been sued? And I'm like, no. Like, really happy about that. And then the buyer will say, well, come back to me when you have been sued. And my point is like, but I'm trying to avoid getting sued. And they're like, the idea is basically, I want you to be battle tested. I don't think that's all I'm trying to say is I don't think that the current regulatory environment is really conducive to innovation. So I actually think if we could scrap that and or come up with new frameworks for evaluating these tools, and I think transparency is at the heart of all of this, is really having a look under the hood and seeing how they behave, and seeing the cost of an assessment, meaning adverse impact versus the benefit. Oh, it's got such great predictive value. Like, I think if we as behavioral scientists had to proffer the kind of evidence that a drug manufacturer does, I think we'd all be in much better shape, because it would really be an environment where I think innovation would be incentivized, as opposed to what happens now, which is there's way too much legal concern, I think, that leads to essentially just people still using technology from the 1970s. So it's a
Hey,
bit of it's a bit of a long answer, but I think it really focuses on, I think that there's going to be a greater call for transparency. I'm all for it. And I think that will really preference companies that are innovative over ones that are not.
I think it makes total sense, because you want for fairness and good rules of the game, so that clients don't get into horror stories that then impact so you actually want some order in the chaos. Let me pick on one of the points you kind of mentioned to touch on, which is how innovative the field is. And as part of their paper, they have the chance or choice to discuss game-based assessments or behavioral science. You're obviously focused on a unique methodology, but there are other innovations in the field. Is there any other of the emerging innovations or tools in the assessment space, or tools for technologies for understanding people, that you think looks promising, that excites you, that at some points you even considered adding to the repertoire? And I won't give examples because you know the field very well. What's your view of kind of emerging tools or methods coming up?
Maybe I've been so focused on the ones that we've been building that I don't have like a amazing sort of a sense of the landscape. I mean, I think some things I have seen that I'm not like as excited by, include everything from so for example, there are people that are doing, sentiment analysis on, I don't know if you'd consider this assessment, but sentiment analysis on, I've scraped all of your Twitter feed or your LinkedIn data or whatever. Like things like that, I don't think are super.
Yeah, absolutely. So that would be one example. Yeah. Yeah. So why not?
Yeah. So other companies, there are companies in Israel I've heard that are actually getting sort of like, galvanic skin response and other physiological measurements. Like, not that excited by that unless it's a very like, I don't know, sensitive use case, like, I don't know, you're in the military or something, facial analysis, I'm not a big fan of that either. I think that has inherent challenges. So I think those are some things that I think are just like, I personally wouldn't go there. I think, there are probably other things one could do in the field. Like, there's a lot of stuff on sort of text analysis that doesn't get into scraping your data. Like, for example, like if you were going to build a communication assessment based on, the text from someone's interview or something like that, that seems perfectly reasonable to me. And something that, we're developing in-house. I mean, so I think our basic guiding principles are, the person should know you're acquiring the data, and they should have agreed to it for that use case, not for some other use case. So active measurement. And then, I think that then precludes a lot of things that it shouldn't be overly invasive, basically. I mean, it shouldn't sort of border on being some sort of like biometric test or something. So I think, if you just adhere to basic principles, I think there are a lot of interesting things you can do. And I'm sure there'll be more interesting things that one can do. I think that unfortunately, I mean, Tomas, like, I think the field is still generally sort of clinging to, general mental ability tests, which 60% of companies use and have massive adverse impact. And, and I think that's just not great. I mean, I just think that that's old science, and I think it's very problematic. And I think that, I always tell clients, I'm like, hey, if you're going to use a IQ or a general mental ability test, particularly the sort of more traditional ones, and you want to improve diversity, it's like eating Oreos and brushing your teeth at the same time. Like, good luck, because it's just not going to happen, right? And I think that I think that those are the things that I think are problematic, in the sense that we should be developing new science, not just gamifying old science. And I mean, like, without saying specifics, like, our industrial organizational team has gone to conferences where, they might be presenting a game-based tool that's purportedly measuring IQ. And literally the statement will be, and, here are the differences between, Caucasian scores and African-American scores. And as you can see, there's a big delta, and that's the way that it's working. Meaning the implication is you can tell if a cognitive test is working because certain groups are doing worse on it. That doesn't strike me as new science, right? There are ways that behavioral scientists have developed to measure those exact same qualities in people in a way that's far more fair, right? And that's sort of back to the behavioral science innovation over the last couple of decades. So whatever we're doing in the field, I think we're not doing enough of it, because I think that traditional measurements continue to prevail in a way that I think is problematic. So
yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I do think, I do think that, there, at least we're seeing a synergy between IO and AI coming together to kind of advance the field. Hey, you have to go, right? Because we're over 3 minutes, because there's a couple more questions.
Oh, no, I think I have till 12:30, so feel free.
Okay, perfect. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. So let me ask, there's some great questions coming. One from Yasu that says, especially given your background, Frida, so yeah, your kind of your geeky neuroscientist might come up now.
Yes, absolutely.
Again, are there any neuroscience-based talent signals that you are considering interested in? Something along the lines of brain activity as a predictive tool.
I mean, the short answer is no, because that would definitely trigger ADA law and, biometrics and, yada, yada. I just think first of all, I don't think it's necessary. I think that's where I would start, and secondly, I think it could be problematic, unless you're talking about, you need to hire airline pilots for the SEAL team, and, okay, fine. Maybe I could understand something like that being used in that case. But for hiring, I don't know, waiters for, or banking analysts, I don't think so. No.
Yeah, if you were an employer and I offered to give you the data from my Aura ring, my last 2 years, would you like to take a look at it to see my patterns and what a good sleeper I am?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think then this just comes to sort of national philosophical differences on sort of privacy, individual privacy. I'm sure certain countries would be fine with that. I think, Western countries, generally speaking, veer more towards no. I think with Europe being definitely no, and the US being, I think, no. So I personally don't think you need that. I think it's back to the point that I think people will actually voluntarily, and I would say mostly happily, give you information about themselves if they really believe that you're going to use it in a fair way and that they're going to benefit from it. Does that make sense? And I also think that, like, my sleep data or something else like that is just not that relevant, if that makes sense. So
I mean, when it comes to social media, they are giving information apparently voluntarily, or that, and what they're getting with.
No, but it's different though. So Tomas, the way they get away with it is basically in many ATSs, you have to check a box saying, oh, a recruiter can look at my LinkedIn, because they want to make sure you haven't said, fuck, I don't know, something, right? You gave that ability to the recruiter, not for some algorithm to come and suck up all the data and then give you a score. You know what I mean? And so that's what I mean. Like, you have to have approved it for the particular. Yes, that's my understanding of how they get away with it. So.
Of course. Hey, another question on ethics. Yep. I mean, this one on ethics and accuracy trade-off. So when you design and advanced or kind of created your algorithms, can you mention any specific trade-offs that you may have faced between kind of the predictive side and
Right,
fairness or ethics?
That goes back to the data issues. So yes, you have massive issues with trade-off in performance and fairness if you have differences in base rates in the data. We don't have those. They're very minor, so we don't actually see those trade-offs. So it just goes back to the data matters a lot.
Mm-hmm. The data matters a lot, yes. And so when we heard about the famous cases of kind of biased chatbots, etc., I mean, mostly it's an issue of poor training sets, right? I mean, they're effectively trained to predict bias that exists in the system, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's the problem, though, Tomas, is that it's not just hiring; it's loans, it's financial inclusion, it's healthcare. I mean, all social sciences are rife with bias, rife, and so it's. And that's the problem, right? If you just train an algorithm on historical data, you will get biased algorithms for sure, like guaranteed, right? So then you have to, as a technologist, you have to spend a lot of time thinking, how do I avoid that? That's the question, because to replicate it is easy. To avoid it is really hard.
So you talked about, the kind of backwardness or the lack of creativity or innovation in academia, in the problems with other vendors, and kind of, what could and should happen to the field. But how could things improve from the perspective of the job seeker, right? So if we compare about a talented but overlooked or undermined job seeker today, in an ideal world, if everything is possible, and I know that you have a very strong and compelling vision about this, in 10 years' time, how would life be better for talent or for a job seeker?
You mean if these innovations come to pass? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if we can really truly leverage the power of behavioral science and apply it in an ethical way, how would life be better for the average job seeker?
Yeah, and by the way, like, I think the reason I'm saying innovation isn't flourishing is not because people are not inherently innovative. I actually think the incentive structure is not aligned with innovation. Just to be clear, I think there is lots of people who would love to be innovative, but fear these sort of legal,
or they're not rewarded for it, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I'm a big believer in human creativity. So I think that, I mean, at the end of the day, like, the way that I always describe Pymetrics is that we can train on a homogeneous set of white men, and then find, because the data is equally distributed, we can find people that have those characteristics in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. You know what I mean? And so I think that if we start to use better data and better algorithms, we really can advance the goal of equality without making a sacrifice on fairness, or like individual fairness or accuracy or whatever. I think that that's the message that I try to get across as much as possible, is that this notion that we have this trade-off between diversity and performance is because we've been using this very biased data. And I think if you can get away from this very biased data, it's a mathematical proof, like, you don't actually have to make these trade-offs. And I think just historically, we haven't looked at different data sets. So I think that that's really, what I would say. I think and this is totally different, but I think this is also another important thing just to think about in terms of the job seeker. I think, one of the things that I would love to see change in the job seeker, and this was definitely a problem at HBS, was that, people think there's like 3 career choices you can make that are going to lead you to happiness, right? Or whatever, or at least financial security. I'm not sure. And I think so many of us go, like, there's still so much, there are so many messages out there that the gist of these messages comes down to, don't be yourself, be this other person over here, and then you'll be perfectly qualified for all these jobs. I think that's really unfortunate. I think I've never been happier than since I became an entrepreneur, in part because my dogged persistence, which used to be a pain in everyone's butt beforehand, and every other job I've had was finally like a quality that was not only appreciated but like highly necessary. And so yeah, and so at the same time, it was definitely entering a field where there aren't a lot of women, there's more risk for women, blah blah blah. So it's not like the obvious path, but it was the path that sort of suited me the best. And I think that we have to encourage people to take risks, be brave, and be themselves, as opposed to, oh, like, don't be brave, don't take risks, just mold yourself into this thing over here, and then you'll be marketable to all these jobs that you might not actually want. And I think, unfortunately, that's still a lot of the message, so.
Great. A couple more questions. So a dual question, or a question that has two elements. I'm going to try to summarize. Basically, how do you stand out from the competition? What's your kind of how do you distinguish? How does Pymetrics distinguish from the competition? And also, how do you make that distinction or competitive advantage clear, even to an unsophisticated buyer or audience?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple things. I mean, we are an enterprise product, and so generally we're dealing with clients that are more likely to put you through the software vendor version of a proctology exam than we are not, meaning that the types of things we've been asked to produce is mind-blowing. And so I think if you start with that set of clients, then it's almost like word of mouth to some extent. Like, people sort of realize, oh, wow, okay, well, they can meet the standards of this client, then I'm good. You know what I mean? They'll obviously going to meet my standards. So I think it's sort of, I wouldn't say word of mouth marketing, but I think in the enterprise, I think, having certain types of clients that will then use you and people know that they're using you, then sort of goes a long way towards differentiating you from others. Like, I mean, without mentioning the client because they would kill me, we had one client that had tested, I don't even know how many vendors, a lot. And literally they produced all this documentation without telling who the other vendors were, obviously. And we were like the only one that passed both their, accuracy and their fairness. And it was just insane how much work these people had done, but they're known in the field for that. And so, if you can pass their standards, then you're probably going to pass a lot of other folks' standards. So our approach to differentiating ourselves has been heavily dependent on, having a product and scientific differentiation that we can showcase to sort of key influencers in the field. And, that's been one strategy. And then, honestly, I think another strategy is just that, I think as the founder and also as sort of like innovator in the field of, behavioral science and all that, I think just really getting that message out there, and trying to get that message spread as far and wide as possible. So, and that really just rests on me and me going around and talking to people and getting the message out. So
great. Frida, final question. What will you do in your next life, or what would you do if after, I'm sure you will, so after you finish successfully solving this problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Tomas, will have to go have lunch and many glasses of wine, and then I'll have some more creative answers for this. I think there's so many different fields that are interesting. So one field that I think is very behavioral science related and also very interesting is the field of disinformation. So I'm sure we were all following disinformation in the last, 6 months, 12 months, 4 years, however long. It's a decades long problem. It's psychological warfare, right? That was started by, foreign armies, who knows what war it was first, brought to bear, and has now been sort of unleashed by wittingly or unwittingly, social media companies on domestic populations, right? And this whole idea that, certain groups have been radicalized internally, in certain thought patterns. Like, I think even if you fix the underlying circumstances that have led to the radicalization of certain groups in this country, I don't necessarily think you fix the disinformation problem. So that's just a very interesting problem, I think, from a behavioral science perspective of how do you fix that problem? So I'll leave you with that.
Great, Frida. Thank you so much for your generous time and
Absolutely.
giving us unfiltered access to your brain.
100%. It was great.
I'll let people thank you either with virtual applauses or real kind of voices. But
Yep.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah,
and have a great
absolutely,
weekend.
guys.
And I hope next time we meet in person. Whenever that
Absolutely.
is.
We will definitely do that. All right. Bye, guys. Take
Thank
care.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.